Ever wonder how Roman soldiers marched thousands of miles carrying meat that stayed fresh for months? While we panic when the power goes out and our freezer starts defrosting, Romans built an empire on perfectly preserved provisions that could outlast entire military campaigns, feeding legions from Britain to Egypt without a single ice cube in sight. Salt was the foundation of Roman preservation, but calling it simple would be like calling Roman engineering basic. The Romans didn't just sprinkle salt on meat and hope for the best. They turned salt curing into a precise science that would make modern food scientists jealous. Romans inherited salt curing techniques from Greeks and other Mediterranean peoples, then improved them with typical Roman efficiency. They discovered that different salts worked better for different purposes. Sea salt, harvested from coastal evaporation ponds, had a coarser texture, perfect for drawing moisture from large cuts of meat. Rock salt from inland mines, like those in Salzburg, produced finer crystals that penetrated smaller pieces more evenly. The economics of salt shaped the entire empire. Roman soldiers received part of their pay in salt rations. That's literally where we get the word salary from the Latin salarium. A single pound of quality salt could preserve 50 pounds of meat, making it more valuable than gold in frontier territories. The Via Salaria, or Salt Road, became one of Rome's most important trade routes, connecting coastal salt works to inland cities. Roman butchers followed strict ratios, roughly 1 pound of salt for every 10 pounds of meat, adjusted based on climate and intended storage time. In hot African provinces, they used heavier salt concentrations. Northern territories like Britain required less salt but longer curing times. The process was methodical. Meat was packed in alternating layers of salt and left for specific periods based on size and type. Archaeological evidence from Roman military camps shows standardized salt curing facilities, complete with drainage systems for brine runoff. Soldiers knew exactly how much salt to pack for campaigns of different lengths. But even Rome's salt mastery had limits, and ambitious generals needed preservation methods that could work in the humid coastal regions where salt alone often failed. When salt couldn't handle humid coastal conditions, Romans turned to their secret weapon, garum, a fermented fish sauce that became the empire's most effective liquid preservative. Think this sounds disgusting? Romans considered it so valuable that premium garum cost more than fine wine. Garum started as a Greek invention, but Romans perfected it into an industrial operation. The process was surprisingly complex. Fish entrails, salt, and whole small fish were layered in large vats and left to ferment in the sun for several months. The mixture would slowly break down into a potent amber-coloured liquid that could preserve meat for years. The smell was legendary. Garum production facilities were built downwind from cities because the stench could be detected for miles. Spanish coastal towns like Baelo Claudia housed massive garum factories with dozens of fermentation tanks, each holding thousands of gallons. North African production centres in modern-day Tunisia supplied garum across the Mediterranean, employing hundreds of workers who probably never escaped the smell. Not all garum was created equal. Premium garum sociorum, made from tuna blood and organs, was served at elite dinner parties. Middle-grade garum satisfied merchants and soldiers. The cheapest version, made from fish scraps, was distributed to slaves and the urban poor. Each grade had different preservative strengths based on salt content and fermentation time. Romans discovered that garum's high salt content and acidic properties created an environment where harmful bacteria couldn't survive. They would coat meat completely in garum, then pack it in sealed containers. Pork, beef, and even poultry could last months this way. Military supply records show entire legions carried garum-preserved meat rations. But liquid preservatives had their limitations too, especially when Romans needed to transport meat across vast distances where containers might break or spill. For preservation that couldn't break or spill, Romans perfected smoking techniques that turned their kitchens into precision smokehouse operations. Wealthy Roman households built specialized fumariums, dedicated smoking chambers that could process hundreds of pounds of meat at once. These weren't simple barbecue setups. Archaeological excavations at Pompeii reveal sophisticated smoking facilities with multiple levels, adjustable vents, and drainage systems for collecting valuable fat drippings. The Villa of Papyri had a fumarium that could smoke meat at 3 different temperatures simultaneously, depending on how high you hung the food. Romans understood that different woods produced different flavors and preservation qualities. Oak created the most reliable preservation for long-term storage. Applewood gave pork a sweet flavor that wealthy Romans prized for dinner parties. Cherrywood was reserved for poultry, while olive wood, both abundant throughout the Mediterranean, provided a distinctive taste for beef and lamb. The smoking process required constant attention, which meant dedicated slave labor. Skilled smoking slaves commanded high prices because they understood the precise timing needed for different cuts. They knew when to adjust airflow, when to add fresh wood, and how to combine smoking with salt curing for maximum preservation. Roman smoking operations often processed entire animals. A large villa's fumarium could handle 6 whole pigs, dozens of chickens, and countless fish simultaneously. The smoke had to penetrate completely. Undersmoked meat would rot within days, while oversmoked meat became inedibly hard. Romans frequently combined smoking with other preservation methods. They'd salt cure meat first, then smoke it, then sometimes finish with a garum coating. This multi-step process created provisions that could survive Mediterranean voyages, but even perfectly smoked meat had its weaknesses, particularly when Roman merchants began trading in the scorching deserts of Africa and Arabia. When extreme heat threatened even the best smoking efforts, Romans discovered that exotic spices could create preservation miracles that worked in any climate. What started as luxury flavouring became essential food science, transforming the empire's entire approach to meat storage. Roman spice preservation relied on compounds we now know have powerful antimicrobial properties. Black pepper, imported at enormous cost from India, contained piperine that prevented bacterial growth. Cinnamon bark from Ceylon created an aromatic barrier that insects couldn't penetrate. Cloves from distant Indonesian islands packed eugenol, a natural preservative so effective that a single pound could preserve an entire cow. The spice trade networks that enabled this preservation were staggering in scope. Roman merchants established trading posts from Alexandria to Sri Lanka, creating supply chains that moved tons of preservation spices across 3 continents. A single spice cargo ship could carry preservation supplies worth more than a legion's annual budget. Different meats required specific spice combinations. Surviving recipes from Apicius, the famous Roman cookbook, detail precise formulas. Beef needed heavy pepper and coriander coating. Pork responded best to cinnamon and nutmeg mixtures, while poultry required delicate combinations of cardamom and ginger. Regional variations emerged. Syrian merchants developed fiery preservation blends using local chilies, while Egyptian traders perfected sweet spice mixtures using native herbs. The economic impact was revolutionary. Spice-preserved meat could travel from Britain to Mesopotamia without spoiling, opening new trade routes and military possibilities. Roman armies could campaign in tropical regions previously considered impossible due to food spoilage. Wealthy Roman families maintained private spice collections worth fortunes, employing specialist slaves who knew the secret ratios for different preservation needs. Of course, not every Roman family could afford to coat their meat in imported Asian treasures, which meant preservation quality became a stark symbol of social standing. For Romans who couldn't afford exotic spices, fat-based preservation offered an ingenious alternative that worked just as well. They discovered that meat cooked slowly in its own fat, then sealed under a protective layer of oil, could last for years without any expensive imports. The process was elegantly simple, yet scientifically sound. Romans would cook pork in its own rendered fat at low temperatures until the meat became tender and completely saturated. Duck and goose worked perfectly this way too. The cooked meat was then packed into clay amphorae and covered with a thick layer of olive oil or additional fat, creating an airtight seal that prevented spoilage. Roman pottery workshops developed specialized amphorae specifically for fat preservation. These containers had narrow necks that minimized air exposure and thick walls that maintained consistent temperatures. Potters stamped quality marks on preservation amphorae, creating the world's first food storage certification system. Quality control was surprisingly sophisticated. Romans tested their fat-preserved meat by checking the seal's integrity and examining the fat layer for discoloration. They knew that cloudy fat meant contamination, while clear fat indicated perfect preservation. Some wealthy households employed tasters whose job was specifically to test preserved meat quality. Archaeological evidence proves how well this method worked. Excavations at Roman military camps have uncovered amphorae containing fat-preserved meat that's still identifiable after 2,000 years. At Vindolanda, near Hadrian's Wall, archaeologists found sealed containers with intact fat layers, demonstrating the technique's effectiveness even in Britain's damp climate. The amphora system worked beautifully for stationary households and established trade routes, but Roman armies needed something more practical than heavy clay containers when they were marching across continents. Roman military engineers solved the portability problem by creating the ancient world's first standardized field rations, portable preserved meat that could survive months of marching without spoiling. These innovations transformed warfare itself, allowing Roman legions to campaign in territories where other armies would starve. The military preservation system was ruthlessly efficient. Each legion carried specialized portable meat called bucellatum carneum. Small, densely packed portions of salt-cured and smoked meat that weighed almost nothing but provided enormous nutrition. A single soldier could carry a month's worth of meat protein in a leather pouch smaller than a modern backpack. Roman quartermasters established preservation facilities across the empire, creating supply chains that could feed armies thousands of miles from Rome. These weren't small operations. The facility at Lugdunum could process over 10,000 pounds of meat daily during campaign season. Quality inspectors called exactores annoni tested every batch, rejecting any meat that didn't meet strict military standards. The logistics were staggering. Roman armies could march 20 miles per day for months because they weren't dependent on local food supplies or vulnerable supply trains. While enemies had to stop frequently to forage or hunt, Roman legions kept moving with their portable provisions. This gave Rome decisive advantages in campaigns from Britain to Mesopotamia. Archaeological evidence from Roman forts shows standardized preservation equipment, identical smoking chambers, salt storage facilities, and meat processing areas from Scotland to Syria. The system was so reliable that Roman military manuals included specific instructions for field preservation techniques. But the military's preservation innovations didn't stay confined to army camps for long, and soon Roman civilians were adapting these efficient techniques for their own households. Civilian Roman households quickly discovered that military preservation techniques worked perfectly for creating sausages, perhaps the most ingenious preservation method Romans ever developed. By stuffing seasoned meat into natural casings, they created portable protein that could last months while actually improving in flavour. Roman sausage making was far more sophisticated than simply grinding meat and stuffing it into intestines. they developed dozens of varieties, each with specific preservation properties. Lucanica, made with pine nuts and wine, could survive Mediterranean heat for weeks. Botulus, a blood sausage packed with fat and spices, lasted through entire winter seasons. The famous farcimen was stuffed so densely with preserved pork that a single sausage could feed a family for days. Preparing intestinal casings required specialised knowledge that Roman butchers guarded carefully. Pig and sheep intestines were cleaned with salt water, then soaked in wine vinegar to remove any bacteria. The casings were turned inside out, scraped clean, then turned back and packed with salt until needed. Quality casings could be stored for months before use. Regional variations emerged across the empire. Gallic sausages incorporated local herbs that added preservation power. Spanish varieties used techniques learned from Iberian tribes, creating intensely flavoured sausages that could survive desert crossings. Germanic regions developed smoked sausages that combined multiple preservation methods. Roman sausage makers formed powerful guilds that controlled quality and training. The Collegium Farcimenum in Rome had over 200 members who supplied sausages to markets, military units, and wealthy households. Master sausage makers commanded high wages and social respect because their skills literally kept people fed. But even perfectly made sausages needed proper storage conditions, and Romans soon realised that preservation success depended as much on where you kept food as how you prepared it. Roman architects revolutionised food storage by engineering underground systems that maintained perfect preservation temperatures year-round. These weren't simple cellars, they were sophisticated climate-controlled chambers that would impress modern refrigeration engineers. The key innovation was adapting hypercaust heating systems for cooling instead of warming. Romans discovered that the same network of underground channels that heated their baths could circulate cool air through storage areas. They built elaborate systems where cool air from underground springs flowed through stone channels beneath food storage rooms, maintaining steady temperatures even during scorching summers. Archaeological excavations reveal the impressive scale of these operations. The villa of the papyri had a 3-level underground storage system with separate chambers for different preservation needs. The coolest level, dug 15 feet underground, stayed at a constant 55 degrees Fahrenheit, perfect for storing fat-preserved meats and aged sausages. Roman engineers used natural landscape features brilliantly. They positioned storage chambers near underground springs, channeling cool water through stone pipes that ran along storage room walls. Air circulation systems included carefully placed vents that created gentle breezes without allowing warm air to enter. The integration with villa design was seamless. Storage chambers connected directly to kitchens through insulated corridors, allowing servants to access preserved foods without exposing them to temperature changes. Some wealthy households had storage areas larger than most modern homes, with separate sections for different types of preserved meat. At Pompeii, perfectly preserved storage rooms show stone shelving systems, drainage channels for condensation, and even primitive thermometers. Lead strips that change colour to indicate temperature changes. But Roman ingenuity truly shone when they had to make these preservation systems work across an empire that stretched from freezing British moors to blazing African deserts. Making preservation work from Scotland's freezing highlands to Egypt's blazing deserts required Romans to abandon their one-size-fits-all approach and embrace local wisdom. Smart Roman administrators quickly learned that conquered peoples often knew preservation secrets that could improve upon traditional Roman methods. In North African provinces, Romans discovered that Berber tribes buried meat in sand mixed with aromatic herbs, creating natural refrigeration that worked even in desert heat. Roman engineers adapted this technique, building sand-cooled storage chambers beneath their forts. The sand absorbed moisture while maintaining steady temperatures, perfect for preserving the dried meat that dessert campaigns required. British and Germanic territories presented opposite challenges. In these cold, damp regions, Romans learned from Celtic preservation methods that used peat bogs and underground ice storage. They built hybrid systems combining Roman engineering with local knowledge. Stone storage chambers lined with peat that naturally controlled humidity, while Roman drainage systems prevented flooding. Egyptian and Asian minor adaptations were perhaps most ingenious. Romans combined their salt curing techniques with local spice preservation methods, creating hybrid treatments that worked in tropical humidity. They learned to use palm fronds as natural wrapping that repelled insects while allowing air circulation. Archaeological evidence from frontier settlements shows this cultural integration clearly. A Roman fort in Morocco contained preservation equipment that was part Roman engineering, part local Berber technique. British Roman sites show storage systems that combined Roman stone construction with Celtic peat lining methods. The most successful Roman settlements were those where commanders encouraged experimentation with local preservation methods. These hybrid techniques often worked better than purely Roman approaches, especially in extreme climates. But none of these localized preservation innovations could have spread across the empire without the massive trade networks that connected every corner of the Roman world. Roman trade networks transformed local preservation innovations into empire-wide systems that moved preserved meat from Britain to Syria with remarkable efficiency. These weren't simple trading routes. They were sophisticated supply chains that made Roman preservation techniques possible on a massive scale. Maritime transportation was the backbone of preserved meat distribution. Roman cargo ships carried specially designed amphorae filled with preserved meats alongside wine and olive oil. These vessels could transport 50 tons of preserved provisions in a single voyage, enough to supply entire legions or feed cities for months. Ship manifests from Alexandria show regular shipments of preserved fish to Rome, while Spanish ports exported garum preserved meats throughout the Mediterranean. Quality control across these vast distances required ingenious systems. Roman traders developed detailed amphora marking schemes that indicated origin, preservation method, production date, and quality grade. Inspectors at major ports could identify substandard preserved meat simply by reading these ceramic labels. A system of seals and stamps prevented tampering during transport. The economic infrastructure supporting preservation was enormous. Specialized merchant guilds controlled different aspects of the trade. The Corpus Splendidissimum handled preserved meat transport, while regional associations managed local distribution. Banking systems allowed merchants in Gaul to finance preservation operations in Spain, creating an integrated preservation economy. This trade network created something unprecedented: dietary standardization across the empire. A Roman soldier in Britain ate remarkably similar preserved meat to his counterpart in Egypt. Citizens in distant provinces could purchase the same types of preserved provisions available in Roman markets. Archaeological evidence shows identical preservation containers from Scotland to the Sahara, proving how thoroughly these trade networks connected the Roman world. But this empire-wide preservation system came with a harsh reality. Your social class determined exactly how well you ate. Social class created a stark divide in Roman preservation quality that meant the difference between gourmet delicacies and barely edible survival rations, while wealthy patricians enjoyed exotic preserved meats that cost more than a slave's annual value. Common plebeians made do with basic salt-cured scraps that were often more salt than meat. Elite Roman households employed specialized preservation slaves who knew techniques that commoners could never afford. These skilled workers understood complex spice ratios, perfect smoking temperatures, and aging processes that transformed ordinary meat into luxury provisions. A single preserved peacock, prepared with rare Asian spices and aged in imported Greek wine, could cost enough to feed a poor family for months. The preservation industry depended heavily on slave labour at every level. Slaves collected salt from coastal works, tended smoking fires through long nights, and processed thousands of pounds of meat in commercial facilities. Most preservation slaves worked in appalling conditions. The garum factories alone employed hundreds of workers who lived permanently surrounded by the stench of fermenting fish. Economic barriers determined food security in harsh ways. Premium preservation methods using expensive spices, fine wines, and exotic techniques were completely beyond plebeian reach. Common Romans had to rely on basic salt curing and simple smoking, which meant their preserved meat spoiled faster and tasted worse. Archaeological evidence shows this disparity clearly. Elite Roman houses contained elaborate preservation equipment and storage areas, while plebeian quarters had only basic facilities. Wealthy Romans could survive food shortages with their stores of luxury, preserved provisions, while poor citizens faced starvation when supply disruptions occurred. But within Roman households, regardless of social class, preservation knowledge and daily food management fell largely to the women who ran these complex domestic operations. Roman women bore primary responsibility for household preservation knowledge, transforming kitchens into carefully managed food laboratories where survival depended on their expertise. The matron of a Roman household wasn't just managing meals. She was orchestrating complex preservation operations that could mean the difference between prosperity and starvation. These women possessed encyclopedic knowledge of preservation techniques that took decades to master. They knew exactly which cuts of meat required longer salting periods, how different spices interacted with various preservation methods, and when seasonal conditions were perfect for smoking or drying. Roman matrons could evaluate meat quality with a glance and adjust preservation techniques accordingly. Knowledge transmission followed strict mother-to-daughter patterns that created generations of preservation experts. Young Roman girls began learning preservation skills around age 7, starting with simple tasks like preparing salt mixtures and gradually advancing to complex techniques like spice blend creation and fermentation management. By marriage age, a well-trained Roman woman could manage preservation operations for households of 50 or more people. Gender-specific responsibilities extended beyond technique to strategic planning. Women managed preservation schedules, coordinated seasonal activities, and maintained detailed inventories of preserved foods. They decided when to begin winter preparations, which meats to preserve first, and how to allocate precious preservation materials like imported spices. Archaeological evidence reveals dedicated women's work areas in Roman houses. Rooms equipped with grinding stones for spice preparation, specialised cutting surfaces, and storage areas for preservation tools. These spaces show clear evidence of intensive food processing activities. Roman women also managed the social aspects of preservation, organising communal preservation activities and sharing techniques with neighbours. But preservation knowledge in Roman society extended far beyond practical necessity into the realm of religious belief and cultural tradition. Preservation practices became deeply woven into Roman religious and cultural identity, transforming practical food storage into sacred rituals that connected Romans to their gods and ancestors. These weren't simply cooking techniques, they were cultural expressions that defined what it meant to be Roman. The festival of Terminalia in February featured elaborate displays of preserved meats that had survived winter storage, celebrating both divine protection and human skill. Families would present their finest preserved provisions at household shrines, thanking the gods for successful preservation. The festival of Robigalia included ritual offerings of preserved meat to prevent crop diseases, showing how preservation connected to agricultural prosperity. Roman religious ceremonies incorporated specific preservation techniques as sacred acts. Priests performed ritual salt blessing ceremonies before major preservation seasons, invoking divine protection for food stores. The Vestal Virgins maintained sacred preservation fires that were believed to ensure Rome's food security. If these fires died, the city's preservation abilities would fail. Cultural taboos shaped preservation practices in surprising ways. Romans considered certain preservation combinations unlucky. Mixing pork and beef preservation was thought to invite misfortune. Regional preferences reflected cultural identity. Gallic Romans preferred smoked meats that connected them to ancestral traditions, while urban Romans favoured elaborate spiced preservation that demonstrated sophistication. The Roman religious calendar integrated preservation activities seamlessly. Spring preservation ceremonies marked the beginning of the preservation season, while autumn festivals celebrated successful food storage. These timing wasn't arbitrary. It synchronized practical preservation needs with religious observance. Archaeological evidence shows household shrines dedicated to preservation deities, complete with offerings of preserved meat and preservation tools. Romans genuinely believed their preservation success depended on divine favour. But beneath these traditional religious practices lay a revolutionary Roman approach that transformed ancient preservation methods through systematic innovation and scientific thinking. Roman preservation techniques represented a revolutionary leap from ancient trial and error methods to systematic scientific approaches that fundamentally changed how humans understood food storage. While other cultures stumbled upon preservation accidentally, Romans deliberately studied why their methods worked and continuously improved them. Roman innovations went far beyond inherited Mediterranean techniques. They developed standardized measurement systems for salt ratios, created temperature control methods for smoking chambers, and invented specialized tools like bronze meat cutting implements designed specifically for preservation cuts. Their amphora sealing systems used mathematical precision to create airtight storage that previous civilizations never achieved. The Roman scientific understanding was remarkably sophisticated. They recognized that preservation worked by removing moisture and preventing bacterial growth, even without understanding bacteria themselves. Roman agricultural writers like Columella documented specific environmental conditions needed for successful preservation, noting humidity levels, air circulation requirements, and seasonal timing with accuracy that matches modern food science. Roman technological improvements revolutionized preservation equipment. They invented mechanical devices for consistent meat cutting, developed specialized smoking chambers with adjustable ventilation, and created preservation vessels with standardized sizes that enabled mass production. Archaeological sites reveal bronze preservation tools that show clear engineering improvements over earlier crude implements. Documentation was perhaps Rome's greatest preservation innovation. Unlike previous cultures that relied on oral tradition, Romans wrote detailed preservation manuals that survived centuries. Apicius documented precise recipes, while agricultural writers recorded seasonal preservation schedules and quality control methods. These Roman innovations directly influenced medieval European preservation techniques. Monastery preservation methods, medieval guild standards, and early modern food storage systems all trace their origins to Roman practices. The lasting impact of Roman preservation mastery extended far beyond mere food storage, fundamentally shaping how civilizations approach food security and culinary culture. Roman preservation mastery created a legacy that reaches directly into modern kitchens, connecting today's food lovers to ancient techniques that have survived 2 millennia of cultural upheaval. Walk into any Italian delicatessen and you're experiencing Roman food science that has been refined but never fundamentally changed. Modern Italian cured meats trace their lineages directly to Roman preservation methods. Prosciutto follows the same salt-curing principles that Roman legions used for portable meat. Salami uses fermentation techniques that Romans perfected in their garum factories. Even bresaola, that delicate air-dried beef, employs Roman spice preservation methods adapted for alpine conditions. Archaeological discoveries continue revealing Roman preservation sophistication. Recent excavations at Roman London uncovered perfectly preserved smoking chambers with adjustable air vents. DNA analysis of residue from Roman amphorae has identified specific spice combinations that modern food scientists are now studying for their antimicrobial properties. Roman techniques survived the empire's collapse because monasteries preserved both the knowledge and the practices. Medieval monks copied Roman agricultural texts and maintained Roman-style preservation facilities. Guild systems that emerged in medieval Europe followed organisational patterns established by Roman preservation associations. The modern revival of Roman cuisine has sparked renewed interest in ancient preservation methods. Contemporary chefs study Roman texts to recreate historical flavours, while food scientists analyse Roman preservation chemistry to understand why their methods work so effectively. Roman food security systems offer crucial lessons for modern supply chains. Their emphasis on diversified preservation methods, standardised quality control, and distributed production networks created resilience that modern systems often lack. When supply disruptions threaten contemporary food security, Roman approaches to preservation and distribution provide proven alternatives. Next time you bite into aged cheese or cured meat, remember, you're tasting innovations that helped build an empire and continue feeding the world today.